Hi everyone, we've been talking about biodiversity so far this unit, and there are many factors that affect species diversity in particular. So in this video, what we're going to be discussing is the factors that specifically affect species biodiversity on island ecosystems. Island biogeography is the study of how species are distributed and how they interact on islands. And the islands that we're focused on can be actual islands that are in a body of water or in the ocean, or they can be figurative habitat islands. And figurative habitat islands are things like Central Park, things like national parks that are natural areas that are separated from other natural areas. So, such as in Central Park, we have this really great greenery. Around it is a lot of city and not as much park. So that is a figurative habitat island. So in the study of island biogeography, scientists looked at how species are distributed and how they interact, and they came up with this theory called the theory of island biogeography. This theory has several big ideas. We're going to go through three of them today, which are kind of the three main ideas that you need to get out of this lecture. The first one that scientists have determined is that larger islands have more species than smaller islands, and this occurs for several different reasons. First, dispersing species or species that are coming from a mainland and migrating away from it towards islands are more likely to find larger islands than they are to find smaller ones. So just in general, if you're moving away from the mainland, you're more likely to run into a large island than you are into a small one. Also, larger islands can support more individuals of a given species. So this is important because larger populations are less likely to go extinct. So even if the same number of organisms came over to a small and a large island, they would succeed better on the larger island because they have more access to resources. And when they have more access to resources, that will support that large population, and they will keep high levels of genetic variation. If you're in a small island, there's going to be a lot of competition. A lot of organisms are not going to make it. They're going to be outcompeted. So that population will get smaller, and the levels of genetic diversity or genetic variation will reduce as well. So on a larger island, we have lower extinction rates as opposed to a smaller island. That's because we have more resources and there's less competition in general. And then finally, large islands typically have a wider variety of habitats. So what that means is there's a variety of living and non-living, so biotic and abiotic conditions that can support a larger number of species. In addition to just supporting the species that get there, when you have a wider variety of habitats, that also provides more opportunities for the evolution of new species on that island over long periods of time. The second big idea is that islands that are closer to the mainland will support more species. So if we have two islands that are the exact same size and contain the exact same resources, the island that is closer to the mainland will accumulate more species than the island that is further away. And that's because we have higher rates of immigration, higher rates of organisms or new species actually making it to the island that is closer to the mainland. So many species can disperse over short distances. Only a few kinds of species can disperse over really long distances. So if an island is closer to the mainland, it's more likely that species that can only disperse over a really short distance will actually make it to that island. Additionally, when we have an island that's close, we will get more migration from the island to the mainland and from the mainland back to the island. That keeps the genetic diversity of populations on that island high because the organisms on the mainland and the organisms on the island are exposed to different conditions. So we have different resources, different limiting factors, which will lead to natural selection towards some genes on the mainland and some genes on the island. So when you have this migration of these individuals from two populations of the same species, they bring their diverse genetic variations, and that increases genetic diversity. Last thing to know is that it's an inverse relationship between the distance to the mainland and the number of species. So the further you are from the mainland, the less species will be existing on that island. Then our final big idea is that the area of an island will also affect the ecological relationships that exist there. So smaller islands can support far fewer large predators than larger islands. To get a little bit more specific, If you have a smaller island, you are going to most likely have smaller populations of producers and primary consumers. So those again are your plants and your herbivores. When you have small populations of plants and herbivores, it makes it really difficult to support populations of secondary and tertiary consumers. So as we know, thinking back to Unit 1, 90% of the energy at each trophic level is either used up by those organisms or lost as heat. Only 10% of that energy is actually available to the next trophic level. So if you're on a small island that only has a few producers, only has a few primary consumers, it's going to be really hard for those secondary and tertiary consumers to get enough energy to actually survive and maintain a population on that island. When you're at a larger island, you have more resources, there's likely more producers, more primary consumers, and you can actually support a few more predatory species. These graphs represent a model that predicts how many species an island will have based on the size of the island and the distance to the mainland. The red curve represents the rate of colonization, so the rate of incoming species to an island. And the black curve represents the rate of extinction, so the amount of species that are dying or becoming extinct on that island. So if we're just looking at this left-hand graph for starters, this is just kind of a basic one. The place where these two curves overlap, so this point right here is called our equilibrium point or equilibrium number. And that's the point where the number of incoming species is offset by the rate of extinction. So if we now look at the second graph, we have a small island and a large island. This small island, we still get lots of immigration, but we also have higher rates of extinction. So our actual number of species on that island is smaller than our actual number of species on a large island. Then last part of this lecture is many island species have evolved to become specialists as opposed to becoming generalists. So many island species are specialists. That's because we have limited resources on most islands. So this is a way to reduce competition. So in order to reduce competition, these organisms try to utilize the limited food resources, and we can see what happens in organisms like the Galapagos finches. You've probably seen these in your biology class, but these finches over time have evolved very specific structures to actually utilize different food types. If they were all competing for that same food type, less finches would have survived on these Galapagos islands. Their actual evolutionary radiation or their development of new evolutionary traits has caused them to become more successful. So these finches, they've got a variety of beak shapes and sizes. Some of them are really big. These are finches that primarily eat things like nuts and seeds that may have a pit or a hard shell. And we have finches that have really kind of small beaks that are probably better for catching things like flying insects. Additionally, another thing with islands is that many island species lack predators. That's because, again, if you don't have many producers and you don't have many primary consumers, that island food chain can't support many secondary or tertiary predators or carnivores. So if these island species don't come into contact with predators, and when you're kind of isolated on an island, you have less likelihood of having pathogens introduced as opposed to when you are exposed to a lot of different organisms on a mainland. So these species might not have evolved predatory defenses, and they definitely wouldn't have evolved as many defenses to things like pathogens. So these island species that are primarily specialists are very vulnerable to extinction if something about that island changes. So that can mean even if a food source gets wiped out for some reason, they can be very vulnerable to extinction, or if we have the introduction of an invasive generalist species. So if we have an invasive generalist, it can easily outcompete these really specialist species. So your practice FRQ for this section is to describe the processes of colonizing an island habitat. So how are organisms even getting there and what happens when they do? And then describe how the island's distance from the mainland influences the number of species that will colonize that island habitat.